we know that whatever Moshe wanted, he had veto power. He could have said, if God says it's a land of milk and honey, and it's a land we will succeed to conquer, why are they asking for spies? Isn't it evident and obvious? It's because they truly don't trust God, and they believe that maybe God is taking them into a death trap, which ultimately, that's the ominous reports they came back with. Moses should have immediately nipped it in the bud, not allowed it. He vetoed it and said, we're going regardless. And it's obvious from the question. What do you need spies if God has given you every level of guarantee? Why? Why do you need spies to scout out the land? Well, we'd like to see for ourselves. But Moshe didn't veto it. So evidently, they realized, very often when you ask a question, knowing the one you ask the question to, you have to know exactly how to present the question. I'll give you an example. The Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos that when the court interrogates witnesses, you have to interrogate them in a way where they don't realize, or the defendant, you ask questions, what piece of information you're looking for. Because if he could read the judge's mind, he'll feed the judge exactly what the judge wants to hear. The witnesses you interrogate, that's full interrogation. But the defendants, when you pose questions, you have to do it in such a indiscreet way that the defendant doesn't understand what exactly you're looking for, and hopefully you'll get an accurate reading on what happened, what the facts are. The Jews who presented the case to Moshe, they understood exactly who Moshe was, and they understood his ability to quell it and silence them. That should not be a consideration to send spies. So how did they somehow mislead Moshe to present themselves in the most positive light that Moshe should be agreeable that we should send spies? Moshe had one Achilles heel. The Achilles heel was called Chil Hashem, desecrating God's name. If not sending spies may result in God's name being desecrated, Moshe will agree to send spies. So what did they say? God promised us when we go to Canaan, we're going to find houses filled with all kinds of wealth and goodness. So they said to Moshe, don't you think that the Canaanites, they're going to bury the treasures and going to enter into homes which they're going to be totally empty? Nothing's there. And God said, he promised us it's going to be houses filled with wealth and goodness. It's not going to be. So it's going to be a Chil Hashem. It's going to be a desecration of God's name. When Moshe heard the word Chil Hashem, immediately he was hoodwinked. That's Moshe's point. That's his weak point. And we say, well, do you really have to worry about God? You don't have to worry about God. If God said it's going to be, it'll be. But you realize the reason why we have a standing army, although they were meant to conquer Israel, Canaan, on a supernatural level, but we as Jews, we don't rely on miracles. We do what we have to do. And when we've done as much as we could do, we took the initiative, God will bring about the result. So factually, logically speaking, the Canaanites are burying the wealth. We come, it's not going to be there. Therefore, we want to send spies to try to find out exactly where they're concealing, they're burying the wealth. So when we come there should not be a desecration of God's name. Moshe heard that. He says, I hear it well. Let me consult with God. God says, Shlach van noshim. I will allow it. I'm not encouraging it, but I will allow it. Moshe did not know their true intention. God knew their true intention. So if God knew their true intention, why did God allow it? The answer is, God knows everything. God knows exactly when we're going to fail. Because he wanted ultimately to point out the unworthiness of the Jews. They're not worthy to go into Canaan. And this generation will die in the desert that they're not meant to go in, which we'll discuss in a moment. So Moshe agreed because they read his mind and they understood who he was. and they knew exactly how to present it. So now, why did the spies bring back these ominous reports? Because they go to Canaan and they see wherever they go, burials taking place, plague. Everybody is preoccupied and grieving over their dead. And they see giants. They see fruits of abnormal dimension, size. So what do they say? What our assessment is, and these aren't ordinary people, it's a death trap. Everybody's burying their dead, and the only survivors are the giants. So it's clear. God is misleading us. God is taking us into a death trap. It's a land which consumes its inhabitants. That's what 10 of the 12 had said. Kalev and Yeshua, who were the other two, they said, you don't understand. You don't understand. Really, it's the ultimate. As God says, it's a good land, a land that flows with milk and honey. But the reason why all these people are dying, and there's all this disease, and people are grieving, is because when we come as spies, God doesn't want us to be noticed. So as a result of this, these people are totally immersed in their grief, that we shouldn't be noticed, that we should be able to scatter out the land, not being constrained to any degree. That's why. And when it's time to destroy them, God will destroy them. There's nothing to worry about. That's what Kalev and Yeshua said. They're both witnessing the same event, but what determines whether you read it one way or you read the script differently? It's all based on trust. If there's a lack of trust, then you read it based on that lack of trust. It's a death trap. And that's why people are dying. Why is God taking us here? Because he wants to destroy us. Kalev and Yeshua say no. God loves us. God will never do such a thing. We have full trust in him. And if he says it's a land that flows with milk and honey, and it's a good location, a good atmosphere, good environment, it is that. So how do we reconcile the two? There's only one answer. God wants us to have freedom to scatter out the land. Therefore, this is a total distraction for them that they shouldn't notice us. So where everything is rooted in what? Trust or not trust. You trust God, you read the script one way. You don't trust God, you read it in the most negative way. That was the difference between the 10 and the 2. Now, last week we had read about the sin of Miriam. Miriam and Aaron hear that Moshe had separated from his wife Zipporah at Sinai. Because God said, everybody should return to their wives. They're permitted to be involved, to have cohabitation, return to their conjugal obligations. Moshe, you remain with me. You don't go back. When Miriam became aware of this, she said, why is Moshe different than we are? We're prophets, and we live normal lives with our spouses. Why did Moshe separate from his wife? The moment Miriam says this, God says, how did you speak about Moshe, my servant Moshe? Ba'avdi b'Moshe, my servant Moshe. So the Midrash says, if it would have just been my servant, you have no right to speak about him. Why? Evidently, if he's my servant, and I treat him as my servant, and I value him as that, evidently he didn't fail. Regardless of what you think. Secondly, he's Moshe. And if I have that special relation with him, that also is evident he didn't fail. So if compoundedly he is my servant and Moshe, there's no question he didn't fail. So how do you speak negatively about Moshe? Don't you realize he's a different dimension of prophet? He prophesies in the wake state, you people prophesize in the sleep state, and there's no more humble person than Moshe. So why did Miriam speak negatively, critically of Moshe? Although it wasn't in any way to see him negatively. It was really, she was upset that Moshe was doing the wrong thing. But why did she perceive it as that? Because she equated Moshe to herself and to her brother. We're all the same. We didn't separate. Why did he separate? So the issue is, when you see something, you have a question, does the question automatically allow you to pass judgment? And she did pass judgment. Moshe did the wrong thing. Maybe you should hold judgment in abeyance and try to ask God why, or ask Moshe why. She didn't. So when the facts don't somehow meet the personality, you have no right to pass judgment. Although just because that is your only answer, it may not be your only answer. It may not be the only answer. And there was an answer. And God told it clearly. So when you see things and it seems to be contradictory to a certain standard, the answer is not necessarily the way you think. Your way you reconcile is a reconciliation. And that's why Miriam failed. Why does the Torah juxtapose the portion of the spies to Miriam? Because the spies, these evil people, they saw what happened to Miriam and they did not learn a lesson. What lesson should have they learned? They hear from Moshe in the name of God, it's a land that flows with milk and honey. It's a land that's all with only goodness there. They go to Canaan, it seems to be disastrous. Now, how do you reconcile that reality, which they had witnessed, with the narrative which God had communicated through Moshe to them? The way they see it, it's a problem. But if you would have learned the lesson from from Miriam properly, you would hold judgment in abeyance and said, let's wait for reconciliation. Let's wait for the real answer. But they didn't wait for the real answer. They passed judgment. Why did they pass judgment? Because they were lacking in faith. They did not trust God. Because they already had this evil streak in them where they didn't want to see it differently. So their position became actually the answer. So therefore, Risham halolu rov l'lokul musar. These evil people, they could have drawn this valuable lesson not to fail, and they chose not to, and therefore they failed, and they took the whole generation down, and we had to wander for 39 years because of their failing. That's the value of juxtaposing the two positions. This incident of Miriam to an incident of the spies. We find that the most difficult of the tests of Avram Avinu was the binding of Isaac. God says to Avram, your son, who was born to him when he was 100 years old, he's the future patriarch. He will be like the stars of the heaven. He will be like the sand on the seashore. He's the future of the Jewish people. When he's 37 years old, God comes to Avram and says, I would like you to bring him up as a burnt offering. This was the most difficult test. Now, how do you reconcile the two? Firstly, he's the most beloved child. He's the future of existence. Existence, the objective of existence will be met through him. Now God says, we're ending it. So what should have Avram said to God? But you promised me he's going to be like the stars of the heaven. He's the future of existence. But if I slaughter him, there is no future. How do you reconcile the two? The answer is you cannot. So what should have Avram asked? God, seems to be, God forbid, you're reneging. You're going back on your word. Chas v'shel, God forbid. Avram suppressed the question, did not ask the question. The test of the Akedah was not whether he slaughters his son or not, but rather, does he ask the question, doesn't he ask the question? It's a question which is not reconcilable. Only God can reconcile this, because he knows God does not renege. But how's it possible? Know something? We'll wait for God to have the last word here. God had the last word. When he bound him, put him on the altar, what did God say? I only said you should bring him up on the altar as a burnt offering. But after you've put him there, take him down. God never said slaughter him. But how does the human mind read that? How do we process that? Slaughter. I have a problem. I have a question. Doesn't jive. God says, I never said that. But what was the test of Avram? To trust and have faith in God that he doesn't renege and there is no contradiction. But only God is able to reconcile it. You have a question, although you may want to pass judgment based on your personal conflicts. to see it the way you want to see it. But you know something? But you realize you're passing judgment on God. And God only does the right thing. So if that's the case, your reading has to be wrong. But why do you believe your reading is correct? Because you lack of trust. But if you would have learned the lesson from Miriam properly, you would have left it in abeyance and wait for the answer when you get back, and to hear exactly how to reconcile that reality with the fact. When the Jews asked for the right to send spies, at that moment, they already forfeited the right to go into the land. So why did God allow them to send spies? God says, because you asked to send spies, I will let you go, and I will have a scenario present itself where it will be cause for you to be condemned. God should say immediately, because you asked inappropriately, you're not going. Why did God do that? The level of Chil Hashem, the desecration of God's name that came out of this. 12 of the princes go, 10 come back with ominous reports. They slander God. They say things which are unconscionable about God, how he's misleading us, how he wants to destroy us. It was a disaster. And he took the whole Jewish people down because of this. Anybody between the age of 20 and 60 died over this 39-year period. Why did God allow it to happen? God should have said, because initially you lack in trust, you're not going in. Now the question is, when you say that to a person, does he really appreciate his shortcoming? Person says, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. What's so bad about asking the question? Is it so terrible? Do I have a right not to ask a question? I have to remain mum and silent. Why? Now, Avram Avinu, why did we spend 210 years in Egypt? Because God says to Avram, the land of Canaan will be your children's. Avram says, but how do I know my children are going to inherit it? Because they asked that question, God says, your children will be strangers in the land which is not theirs. They'll be enslaved, afflicted for so many years because you asked an inappropriate question. That question indicates a lack of trust. That was enough. It didn't have to be proven. Avram fully grasped it and understood his shortcoming. If God would have said to the Jews, because you asked to send spies, that's enough reason to forfeit the right, it wouldn't have resonated with them. It doesn't make sense. What did we say so terrible? So God says, something, the scenario has to prove itself out. You're going to send the spies, and you're going to see what's going to happen. 10 come back with ominous reports. 10-2, they followed the majority, and the Jews, they bemoaned their fate, they cried, Tisha B'Av night, and God says, this crying tonight will not go for naught, because you cried and you lacked faith. In the future, you'll have a lot to cry about. And therefore, both first and second, Beis HaMikdash were destroyed on Tisha B'Av. It's all rooted in this failing in the desert. You cry a bechina shel chinam, a baseless crying, I'll give you what to cry about in the future. That was God's response to this. But factually it played out, and it was a Chil Hashem. It was a Chil Hashem at a level, after God says, after all you've seen, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea, Sinai, the mun, the wellspring, the clouds of glory. How do you not trust God? Don't you think God's going to deliver the land clear and free? And it will turn out to be a land of milk and honey and everything good? How do you question? After seeing so much, what else, how much more can I prove? So what does that speak? It speaks volumes of we have no relationship. Because how could you have such distrust after I've proved myself endless times over how dedicated I am to you? So ultimately, it was a Chil Hashem. God's name was disgraced, publicly disgraced. Unforgivable, you will all die. You will all perish. Over the next 39-year period, you're going to wander. But that's why it had to manifest itself. But one thing you see interesting. The Ramak, Ramosh Kordoviro, writes in the Talmud Dvorah that we find a term that God is called Melech Nelav. He's the disgraced God. He's disgraced. I'll give you an example. What is the differentiating characteristic between a human being and any other living species? Every living species, it functions, is based on its genetics, instinctive behavior. Everything's instinctive. A human being has instinct, but a human being has choice. And choice can override instinct. We're able to choose to behave as we choose to behave. A person wants to be a tzaddik, you be a tzaddik. A person wants to be cruel, defiant, evil, that's within the realm of his choice. Every human being has that within his purview of choice. But why did God give us free choice? God gave us free choice to go the full gamut, to the right and to the left, extremely to the nth degree to the left, because the only reason why you are deserving when you choose right is because you could have chosen to go to the extreme wrong. Why did God create evil? The Ramchal writes, God created evil that you should not do evil. If there wouldn't be an alternative of evil, the person has no choice. So he only created the negative to choose not to do the negative. And because you chose not to do the negative, to do the positive, that's why the positive has that special value. Because you could have done differently. Therefore, you're fully deserving of taking the initiative to do the positive. And when the person succumbs and does the negative, the evil, you're fully culpable because you had the ability to choose to do the right thing. But you realize, if God gives us the choice to do the negative on the most extreme level, to be defiant, to, God forbid, blaspheme God, but you only have the ability to function in that capacity because God wills that you should have that ability. So God is willing to disgrace himself and to be humiliated and blaspheme, so man should have the ability that when he makes the proper choice, that proper choice should have that special value, that he didn't go left, he went right. You know what this is? So over here, God is allowing this scenario to play out. Send the spies. Because if I just tell you you forfeited the right, you're not going to appreciate it. You'll say, it was a request. We made a mistake. God says you didn't make a mistake. Send spies. Let's see what the reaction is going to be. The vast majority of the Jews believe the 10. But how? That speaks volumes of distrust that they all have in God. God says, if that's the case, it's clear you people don't deserve to go. Because if you have that level of distrust, you're hanging on with a thread at best. That's the value of a relationship. Otherwise, it's interesting. A person has blessing rain down upon him continuously. He's singing the praises of God. Every day I give you an offer and an opportunity that you can't turn down. And you're booming in every sense of the word, the material and the physical. And it's from God. You sing his praises. The moment he serves you a curveball, and things start tottering a little bit, right away the person he stops singing his praises. What happened? But if God is God, why do you only sing his praises? When he does good for you. When you appreciate the material, when he withdraws the material, you're upset. Why are you upset? Are you truly dedicated and believe in who he is, what he's supposed to be? The answer is, it's irrelevant who he is. As long as he keeps giving, then he's great. And that's why the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos, Ava tluya b'davar. Love which is contingent on anything is not true love. Love which is not contingent on anything, that's true love. Meaning, if a relationship is based upon, because I recognize and appreciate who you are, it's not because you do anything for me. Because I see you as special, that love will endure all storms. But if it's only because you've done something for me, the moment you stop doing for me and I feel the lack and the need, the relationship is over. So of course, when God gives you bounty and blessing, so what is that love and that positive feeling to God? What is it rooted in? He's giving you something. It's not because you appreciate who God is. The context you're putting him into is he's your benefactor. He gives you. He only wants you to have good. The moment he doesn't give you what you want, that means you never really appreciate who he was. Never. Because you would revere him. It's unrelated to what he gives you. It's because of what he is. And it's the same thing. If that's not love. This is the litmus test. When you go, let's see how you're going to respond. I mean, when things are flying and out of the ordinary positively, splits the sea, destroys your enemies, you sing his praises. The moment there's a question how to see it, it seems to be it's a land that devours its inhabitants. But if you served God and understand God, who God is for what he is, there's no basis to suspect, to have this level of distrust. That confirms there is no trust. There is no relationship. If that's the case, you people are not going. So God is allowing himself to be disgraced at this exceptional level to prove his point, to give you that choice. So therefore he's Melech Nelav. He's the king that's disgraced. He's willing to disgrace himself for the sake of humanity, the sake of the Jewish people. This is the understanding. There's an interesting Sepharno over here, in his commentary, he says, God says, I will choose the scouts. They are princes, the prince from this tribe, the prince from that tribe. Why not ordinary people? Why specifically this caliber of spies, of scouts? So he explains that when the spies came back and they reported accurately. Everything was accurate. Factually, it was accurate. It was the interpretation of those facts. What did they say? What was the bottom line message? They agreed it's a land that flows with milk and honey. The fruits, the food is of abnormal dimension. People were dying wherever we went. It's this, it's that. Exactly. They didn't exaggerate. They did not fall short of reporting exactly what they saw. The problem was interpretation. They said, therefore, it's a death trap. Kol even Yeshua says no. This is the ultimate. Don't you see how God's hand, how special he is to protect us? What happened when they realized, the Jews hear this and left, they realized that they sinned. Because God says you're not going. All of a sudden, they saw it correctly. But if the facts initially weren't delivered properly and communicated properly, how could they do tshuva? Because now they say, oh, now we understand. It's like, they used to say, as I get older, my father gets wiser. You heard the words when you were a teenager, but you didn't have the level of maturity, of experience of life to appreciate what those words were. But as you learn the lessons of life, all of a sudden, vistas of clarity open up before your eyes. Why? Because now I understand what those words meant. Once the Jews realized they failed, they said, oh, now we get it. And they said, we do tshuva. And they repented. It says they cried, they did tshuva. But God says it's too late. You know why? Because the law is, if a person sins and it's a public desecration of God's name, tshuva is not sufficient. The only atonement comes about, you have to die. After the repentance, you have to die. And that completes the tshuva process. This, what you had done, your failing, was so severe and serious. This was a public desecration of God's name. Therefore, it's unforgivable. The generation between 20 and 60 has to perish over a 39-year period. This is how the Sepharno learns, explains this story here. Now, but he has a punchline, which is phenomenal. The Sepharno says, although they did tshuva, since they're only atoned with death, therefore they have to die. And where do we see that when Chil Hashem takes place, desecration of God takes place, the only atonement is death? Because we find after the golden calf, after Moshe supplicated and we were forgiven, God says, when I will punish them for their failings in the future, part of the punishment will be for the sin of the golden calf. Now, what do these words mean? God did say that to Moshe. The day that I will come and reign in on them and give retribution, part of retribution will be part for the sin of the golden calf. First, let's understand what that means itself. Now, at Sinai, when we said Nasiv Nishim, we accepted Torah unequivocally, we became God's nation. To what level spiritually did we rise? So the Talmud, the Gemara says, we had reverted back to pre-sin of Adam. If we wouldn't have failed with the sin of the golden calf, death wouldn't have had any relevance to the Jewish people. We would have become eternal. The world would have reached its level of perfection. And during that 40-day period, we were in a perfect state, a pre-sin state. But when we sinned with the golden calf, we reverted back to the post-sin state. But now, when Adam ate of the tree of knowledge, that fruit, which is good and evil, what happened to the world? Death was pronounced on the world. Till then, death was not meant to be part of the human equation. Every sin from then going forward till the end of existence is attributed to what? To Adam's failing that he ate of the tree of knowledge. Because he's the one who ingested and integrated and embedded in the DNA of every human being what we call evil. And that's why we all have to contend with this evil that's within us to make choices and suppress it. And we're conflicted, and that's why we failed so badly. So Adam is culpable and guilty and liable for every sin from his time going forward till the end of time. You understand what that means? It's not to be believed. Although he did tshuva for 130 years, but it doesn't change the reality. Factually, any chil Hashem, any sin throughout humanity, throughout history of existence, is due to Adam's eating of that tree of knowledge. We Jews at Sinai, we were able to make a correction. We rose to our level. We went pre-Sinai, pre-sin. If we would have pre-sin, that means sin would have had no relevance to the Jew any longer. We failed with the golden calf. What happened when we failed with the golden calf? We went post-sin. So now, as a result of us choosing to be involved in the golden calf, what did we bring about? We're subject to sin. So now, we being subject to sin now is attributed to who? To the golden calf. Therefore, God says, when you're going to be punished for any sin in the future, part of that punishment is for the golden calf. Because it's only due to the golden calf that you sinned in the future. So they're really linked one to another. Therefore, God says, it will be unpoked you for kadati. When I will punish you for that future sin, part of that punishment will be for the golden calf. Because if not for the golden calf, that future sin could never take place. That's how we understood it. Okay? But he says that's why chil Hashem could only be atoned through death. Now, death is the golden calf. The golden calf was the ultimate desecration of God's name. Anything which has a semblance of that goes back to that. That's Pokti for Kadati. Why would a Jew or anybody desecrate God's name to that degree? You know why? Because we have that level of evil embedded in us, which caused the golden sin, the golden calf, when we chose to do it. Therefore, we're still susceptible to that degree of what? Of failing. That's the reason. So if that's the case, only death atones. As at the time of Adam, only death atoned. And after Sinai, we reverted back to death. Identically, when you do a person does a chil Hashem, you can do tshuva from today forever. The only atonement for that sin, in addition to tshuva, only death. Therefore, the sin of the spies was chil Hashem. Being chil Hashem, the only level of atonement had to be, it's unforgivable, and that's why they had to die. The generation between 20 and 60 had to perish over that 39-year period. And only the future generation went in to Israel. I asked the question. We discussed this last week in the Parsha, that for 39 years, the Jews did not bring the Paschal lamb in the desert. The Jews did not circumcise themselves for 39 years. Why? So the Gemara explains that when you circumcise yourself, the blood has to clot. If the blood doesn't clot, you're going to bleed to death. A person bleeds to death. As a result of that, if a person, let's say, is a hemophiliac, halachically he's not permitted to circumcise himself. Because the act of circumcision is putting your life into jeopardy, and you're not permitted to put your life into jeopardy. Therefore, that type of person is not permitted to circumcise himself. Now, the Gemara says, after the sin of the spies, this week's reading, the northerly wind ceased to blow for 39 years. That wind blowing in existence is integral to the clotting factor in the blood for it to clot. Therefore, it ceased to blow, the Jews cannot circumcise themselves. Because if they would have bled to death. A prerequisite to bring the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, you have to be circumcised. If you have any uncircumcised member in your household, you cannot bring the Paschal lamb. So because the Jews, after the sin of the Meraglim, the spies, could no longer circumcise themselves, therefore the Paschal lamb could not be brought for 39 years. So I asked the question. God should have allowed the only two positive commandments which carry the liability of Koris, circumcision and not bringing the Paschal lamb. So evidently, they're vital, very vital commandments, because you see the liability is so serious, spiritual excision. So God should have allowed the wind to blow, the northerly wind, so the Jews should be able to circumcise themselves, and as a result, they could bring the Paschal lamb. God says, no, you people are not bringing the Paschal lamb because you're not going to be able to circumcise. But why? Why did God deny them the ability of circumcision? Which is, that's the relationship. It's called the covenant, the holy covenant between God and the Jewish people. I mean, did the people fall into such disfavor? God says, I don't want to look at you for 39 years. Is that what happened? Or something other than that? Now, the Jew himself, we always speak about there's a counterbalance between good and evil. Who is the counterbalance to evil? The Jewish people. Yaakov was the most special of the patriarchs. Yaakov fathered the 12 tribes, who were called the tribes of God. Now, who was Yaakov's counterbalance? From the womb, there was Yaakov and Esav. Esav represents evil. Esav is the Edomites, the Romans who destroyed the second temple. Amalek, the Amalekites are grandchildren of Esav. That's who Amalek is. This is the personification of evil. As Edom and Amalek is the personification of evil, the personification of holiness and goodness and godliness is Yaakov. He's the counterbalance. And we are the Jewish people the counterbalance to all evil till the end of time. That's what it is. There's a positive commandment that when we go into Canaan, we have to destroy all the nations of Canaan, because they themselves are a representation of evil in existence. Therefore, they have to be annihilated. And it says no living Canaanite, any of these nations should be left alive. Now, why does the Jew have the ability to counter that evil and suppress it and destroy it? Because we ourselves have a certain innate holiness which gives us that ability if we make the right choices. But what happens because of certain failings? There's a deficiency in your representation, then you don't have the ability to do that. What is the objective of after we come out of the desert? To go into Israel, Canaan, appoint a king, destroy Amalek, and build a temple. Those are the three mitzvahs we were given when we went into Canaan. If this generation who failed with the Meraglim, they would go in, because of the Chil Hashem that they had perpetrated, their spiritual failing, it created such a deficiency in their status, they would have been in a position to expunge and destroy that evil that the Canaanite nations possessed. But what happens if they would have been circumcised? Which circumcision is a representation of removal of that evil. As we said, only after Adam ate of the tree of knowledge, which is evil, did the foreskin grow. Before that, Adam did not have a foreskin. That's the expression of evil. So if God would allow us to remove it, they would have believed they're qualified to go in and destroy the Canaanites, who have that representative evil. Because you've removed that evil. God says, for the next 39 years, that evil cannot be removed. Cannot. Which tags them and tells them, you're not who you think you are. As much as you're my chosen people, this generation has to go to the dustbins of history before the new generation emerges. And only when the new generation emerges, they will be able to conquer and destroy the Canaanim, which represent that aspect of evil itself. That's the reason why God did not allow, during this period of time, the Jews to circumcise themselves and bring the Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, for that reason. There's a beautiful Or Chaim HaKodesh, very fundamental. You know, the Torah tells us that if a man wants to marry a woman, tells us there's a procedure, how she's married. Has to be in presence of witnesses, he has to give something of value. What happens if he's not himself able to marry the wife and he wants to appoint an agent, what we call a shliach? He can appoint an agent because there's a principle, but the Torah says the husband must marry the wife. But we have a principle, agency is the equivalent of the person who commissions the agent. As long as the agent is qualified to perform marriage himself, to be the agent, he could be the equivalent of the husband when he puts the ring on the woman's hand, slaughter it. So what do they all do? They appoint one ritual slaughterer, and he represents every one of the participants, and it's the equivalent as every one of them slaughtered the Paschal Lamb. This is the principle of Shlich Sham Kamoso. There's a linkage, because there's a linkage between the one who commissioned them and the agent. We see the agent as the extension of the person we commissioned. So the Or Chaim HaKodesh explains, asks a question. We find the Torah tells us, after they scouted the land for 40 years, the Torah tells us, Vayelchu vayavo. They went and they came. This is after 40 days. To say they returned, what does it say? They went and they came. So Rashi cites the Midrash, Ma bi osam beitzaro. Just as when they originally came to Canaan, is with these ominous interests to find fault. Afelichosan beitzaro. Just as when they returned, they came back with these ominous ideas. When they left to go to Canaan, they went with the similar ideas. So the Or Chaim HaKodesh asks, it says, when they went, they were tzaddikim. Anoshim, that appellation to identify the spies, they were anoshim. They were men of stature, spiritual stature, they're tzaddikim. So if they were tzaddikim, how do we say that as when they returned evil, when they went also with a certain degree of evilness? But that tzaddikim. So the Or Chaim HaKodesh explains, just as we say, when you appoint an agent and you're linked to the one who commissions you, you represent that person. Identically, when you link to somebody who's evil, that linkage causes some degree of influence, and it actually taints the person who's the agent of the one who's representing. So therefore, when originally they were appointed to represent the Jewish, each tribe, that's before that link was made. They were tzaddikim. They were devoutly righteous. The moment each prince represented his tribe, since the people themselves lacked in faith, it was the people who lacked in faith. Now they're susceptible to their lack of faith, and that compromised the agents themselves. Of course, they had choice. They had free choice. Until then, there was never even a question of a question. Now that we're linked to the source, which lack in faith, that impacts on them. They're also compromised to a degree and makes the test much harder. So the reason why they failed is because the linkage of the agent to the one who the agent's representing. That's why they failed. So initially they were chosen, they were tzaddikim. The moment they were linked, they already had a bias and an inclination to the negative. That's what happens. It's very interesting. We read in Pirkei Avos, Harchek mishochin ra. Distance yourself from a bad neighbor. Al tischaber l'rosha. Don't attach yourself to the evil, to an evil one. Why? Because al tisyayish min haparonus. Because don't despair from tragedy. A person says, I want to be with a rainmaker. I understand he's a bad person. He's not a good Jew. God hates him, despises him. But factually, he has the Midas touch. Whatever he touches is a bonanza, tremendous success. What's wrong? Pirkei Avos says, do not attach yourself with him. You know why? Because when that second shoe falls and he goes down, whoever's attached to him goes down with him. Because you're attached. But you say, we were only in business together. I never compromised my dietary laws. Doesn't make a difference. That level of attachment has a bearing on you. It has some degree of connection to you. It impacts you. It touches you. And it touches you not in a good way. Therefore, Pirkei Avos tells us, don't attach yourself to this kind of person. Stay away from him. Because ultimately, you attach yourself, when the condemnation comes on him, you will be condemned together. That's what's going to happen. The meraglim, the spies, because of that level of attachment, there was an effect. There was a degree of influence. And therefore, they had to fight their demons, which before those demons didn't exist within their emotion, within their minds. And that's why they failed, for that reason. So, it's interesting. Just as we say that in the negative, when you represent an evil person, that connection affects you negatively. What about if you represent a great tzaddik? Somebody special. So representing him in the positive will have a positive effect on your life. Because because you're linked and becoming one and the same of the person you're representing. So you have a better chance of succeeding. So I'll tell you a personal story. When I used to visit Israel many times, and I had a special relationship with Rav Steinman, Zech Tzaddik Livrocha, and he would ask me very often, when I come back to America, could I do this, could I do that? Of course, things for the Jewish people, something which was mitzvah related. So I said to him, I used to refer to him as the Rosh Hashiva. He was the Rosh Hashiva. I said, could the Rosh Hashiva appoint me to be his agent? I'd like to be your agent. When I carry out, you're ask me to do, I'd like it should be your agency. So he asked me why. So I said, so I shared with him the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, what he says. Because if you're linked to a special person, the divine assistance you receive is based on who you're linked to. As in the negative, when you're linked to something negative, there's an impact at a certain level negatively. When you're linked to the source of ultimate goodness and righteousness and holiness, somehow that connection bears exceptional levels of fruit. I said, that's why I want to be your shliach, to be your agent. She already said to me, I've done worse things in my life. You could be my agent. That's what he said to me. Okay? So it's interesting. This is what I said. With Orach Chaim, we find that the Mishkan, who was it incumbent to build the Mishkan? So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh points out back there, the Mishkan is always says is to Moshe. Moshe, build the Orel, do this, do that. The command was never to the Jewish people. So Orach Chaim HaKadosh asks why. Why was the mitzvah only to the Jewish people, to Moshe, not to direct the Jewish people? So he explains, Klal Yisrael were only Moshe's agents. They were his agents. Why? Because God wanted that Moshe should be the beneficiary of the building of the total Mishkan. Since it had to be delegated, Moshe wasn't going to do everything himself. So here the Jews are doing, they're participating, but ultimately, because they're Moshe's agents, he will be the beneficiary of their level of accomplishment. That's why the mitzvah was given to Moshe, for him to delegate, because God wanted him to be the ultimate beneficiary. That's what he explains this. I wanted to say it a little differently. Based on this principle, now, we know that the Mishkan itself was infused to function at its special level, had to be infused with a special intent. And that's why Bezalel oversaw the building of the Mishkan, because Bezalel understood the conjugation of letters that brought about creation. So every aspect of Mishkan had to be infused with a level that you needed divine inspiration to understand exactly what it had to be infused with. Now, the level of inspiration is determined by your own status. Moshe Rabbeinu had the ultimate level of connection because he was the most connected to God. What about Moshe appoints us to be his agents? So now we're impacted because of that connection to Moshe. In our own right, we may be worthy of a certain level of divine inspiration. But now, because we represent him, the level of understanding of inspiration is a new level because of that level of connection. So that's what God said. I want the mitzvahs, your mitzvah, delegate it. So because they're carrying out your agency, your dimension of specialness now carries over to them. Therefore, what they are worthy of, it's not their personal worthiness. Their worthiness is only because it's linked to you. Therefore, their grasp and their understanding far surpasses anything that they are. And therefore that's why the mitzvah was given to Moshe to delegate it to the Jews. The Gemara in one location has a question. When the Kohanim who officiate in the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash, and now you bring a sacrifice, whose agent is the Kohen? The agent of the one who brings the sacrifice, or the God's agents to carry out their service to God, and the person who brings the sacrifice is only a byproduct of that? What's the halachic difference? If the one who brings the sacrifice says, I will not benefit from the Kohen, he makes a vow. On a personal level, he's not permitted to benefit from the Kohen. Could this Kohen officiate on his behalf when he brings the sacrifice? Well, if he's the agent of the one who brings the sacrifice, he's not permitted to officiate on his behalf because he made a vow not to benefit from the Kohen. But if the Kohen serves God, he's God's agent, and this is only a byproduct that he's a beneficiary, then he's permitted to officiate. So the expression of the Gemara is it shluchi didan or shluchi derachmano? The Kohen, is he our agent or is he God's agent? Is he the agent of God? So what I wanted to say, God is infinite. Let's say a person, when you live as a Jew, you live purely for the sake of God. So whose agent are you? You're God's agent. I'm carrying out the will of God. So if you link to that, what level of divine and worthiness do you ascend to? If God is infinite and I'm rooting myself in that, that's my linkage. So if that's the case, what do I merit? I merit something that goes far beyond anything that's finite. You merit the ultimate. So the dimension of your value of accomplishment surpasses anything of an ordinary mortal. It goes beyond the finite restraints of what a mortal is. Therefore, a person, if you strive to do better and to do greater for the sake of God, the dimension of the value of that action becomes godly and truly godly. We'll stop here today. We have a Shmaitzer class at 4 to 5, and tomorrow at 10 to 6 in the morning, and tomorrow at 12. Tomorrow I'm not going to be able to